Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malfers Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and A.J. Mathieu.
Welcome to episode 31 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. In this week's episode, AJ and I described the three-step process churches must go through to change their culture. The gap between your reality and your ideal vision is rooted in the need for fundamental change. And this change at its core is not just a change of strategy, but a change of culture in your church. And this week, we walk you through the three steps that your church will need to navigate if you want to shift your culture to unlock your vision. So to read today's show notes, visit malfersgroup.com/31, malfersgroup.com/31. Now, let's dive in.
All right, welcome to episode 31 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. And today, Scott and myself, my name's AJ, we are talking about how culture changes. And this is just a 30,000-foot view of kind of three main points in which the culture of a church can change. And we see this in the world as well, how things change over time. So that's what Scott and I are going to talk about today, to give you maybe an idea of being able to frame some things. We're not going to really get into specifics of things that might need to change in your church. But I think thinking through maybe these points will help you be able to frame up the things that you see that need to change, and then maybe give you some ideas, again, at this 30,000-foot level, that might need to take place in order to begin to affect change in your church. Right, Scott?
Yeah, that's exactly it. We encounter churches all the time who say, the problem that we have is with our culture. The culture at our church is, this or that or the other thing. And it's true lots of times that the culture is the problem. And the good news is that your culture can change. You are not confined to the culture of your church as it is right now. It is something that can be adapted and changed, and can be improved and become healthy. And a great resource for this, if you're really interested in this topic and want a more in-depth look at it, and not just sort of the 30,000-foot level that we're going to give you today, is a book called Look Before You Lead. It's one of Aubrey's books called Look Before You Lead. The subtitle, How to Discern and Shape Your Church Culture. So some of these ideas that we're talking about today are kind of echoed and described in more detail in that book, but it's a great resource in learning how to understand the culture of your church and how to shape the culture of your church moving forward. So we have just three main points that we want to get through today to tell you how the evolution of a church culture, how it can be shaped, how it can be changed. And the first item, not rocket science here, but you have to sort of put forth the idea of what that new culture should be, or what, almost like putting a vision, right, AJ, of what you want that culture to become. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, this is not rocket science, but at some point in time, whenever there's a spark that ignites a culture change, be it in the world or in the church, it starts with a new idea being put forth. And so this can happen by an individual, can certainly happen, with a pastor, especially a visionary pastor might do this. Or in maybe if you want to get into kind of the church revitalization context, we assemble with a church, a strategic leadership team. And in the course of that work and that conversation and that really digging into who are we as a church and how do we presently act, new ideas can be birthed out of that. But it's going to take that spark. I mean, it has to be something, a point in time in which something new is put forth that says, this is what we should be doing. This is who we wish we were. This is how we wish we acted or what we do. Culture is kind of a broad term. And I mean, it certainly is going to involve behaviors and thoughts and ideas. But whenever something new, a change, a shift from where we are today is put forth, and you can begin to have other folks maybe affirm that and say, that is a good idea, then you are at the beginning of a culture change.
Yeah, it all starts with you got to put that idea forth and cast that vision for who you want to be. And there has to be a recognition, AJ, that where we are right now is not an acceptable it's not an acceptable place. This past weekend, I was working with, well, I don't want to say where it was or whatever, but I was working somewhere, and in the church that I was in, it was literally stepping into the 1960s. And that was the glory days of this church, and you could feel it. And there was, I got to speak to a couple of the folks who have been there since that church was started in that location, and the heartbreak that they have about, remembering what it was like when that church, was full and having to pull chairs out for people because there were so many people. And now, it's like stepping into a museum of this moment that happened. And so there's lots of things about that culture that need to change, but it won't change unless a vision is cast for what it could be in the future, rather than, literally they've built a fence around this facility. So there's this visualization of protecting what was and not really embracing what could be.
Yeah. Well, and I guess maybe an example, from my not so distant experience as well, is a church that in the course of their work and conversation, it was brought up that, in the past, they've become aware of having a reputation in the community of being a little stuck up or kind of snobby. And, that is something that will take a culture change to be able to kind of push back against that. If it's true. So first of all, you have to decide, is this true of us or is it not true of us? I think they kind of decided, at least in the past, that was true. But in order to change your reputation, you're certainly going to have to change your culture so that your actions and your words and the way you are will now re-permeate your surroundings and your community, and you'll have something new. People will think of you differently. But that idea first had to be floated. Like, maybe we're not seen as welcoming. We're seen as somebody that would be off-putting. So how are we going to change our culture? Well, there's step one. We've identified that we have something that needs to change, and we can sort of look at what's the opposite of that. This is kind of an exercise, Scott, that you have kind of developed in the church that we use now, of what is our present state and what is kind of our ideal future, which in many cases
rocket
is
science,
sort of the
isn't
opposite,
it? Wow. Here's where we are.
We today? Where do we want to be?
Where we're going to be.
Yeah.
But it's often very enlightening.
Yeah.
It's taking the time to do it. Okay, let's move on to number 2 here, AJ. So once we sort of cast that vision for the culture we want to have, and we sort of begin to articulate that a little bit, we kind of have to start then, as I'm understanding it, as you written this, AJ, sort of at that external level, at sort of the, in the book, in the Look Before You Lead book, Aubrey uses a metaphor of like an apple. And this is sort of the skin of that apple, that outward exterior of it. So that's where the change has to initiate, is from the outside in. So tell me a little bit about that, sort of that outside layer of change.
I kind of see this second step as a bridge. I don't know, to use my own metaphor right here, I suppose. But
thanks for not using the apple metaphor, AJ. And I'm going to send an email to Aubrey and be like, AJ did not like your apple.
AJ rejected the apple. What are we going to do? So we're talking about three steps here. We're super simplifying culture change. But all right, we've got an idea. What do we need to do? What's the next step? To me, it's a communication step. So, if we want people to embrace a new idea, we have to tell them about it. And so I think this is the bridge to action, is a well-communicated idea. And helping people to then visualize, what are we going for? Getting people to embrace a new vision, you've got to explain to them, what is my new vision? And we use this a lot when we talk vision in the church. It has to be visual. It has to be able to be expressed verbally in a way that captures people. Right. And I think we see that in the broader culture as well. Whenever a culture shift happens, a new idea has been expressed and it becomes communicated very well. It's communicated broadly. It's communicated often. And that's how you begin to build that momentum for change, is when lots of people now have heard about and embrace what you're talking about. And I like, offline when we were talking, Scott, earlier, and kind of going back to this church that you were talking about that was sort of stuck visually, aesthetically, their building and their interior aesthetic was very old fashioned. And you talked about how, if you want to begin to think differently and act differently, change your space, maybe it will just be redecorating. Well, I had a church like this. We did I did a setting review, a guest experience, and they had, some very nice furniture where they would do their meet and greet with the pastor afterwards, but it looked like grandma's living room. And they said to me, "This is not who we are." And they were really already future thinking. This is not who we are. When you use that language, this is not who we are presently, even though maybe that isn't who you are presently. You are something else. But they wanted to change that furniture out because it doesn't convey who we believe we are to be and who we are going for. So making that aesthetic change can affect people's attitudes, people's actions, people's beliefs. And I think that's all part of communication, because communication is not only verbal, it's also very, very much visual.
We cannot underestimate or devalue the role that sort of the external things play on our internal person. So, people kind of joke, not joke. I mean, I think they say it legitimately, like you dress for the job you want, not the job you have, right?
Yeah.
Like we talked off air about the book of Haggai, right? Like, why was God so obsessed with them building the temple and getting that done? He doesn't need a house. Like, God does not, he is not a man that he would need a house. But it was about how they viewed themselves and how they viewed God, and the lack of a completed temple was a reflection of their internal self. That external thing was a reflection of their internal self. So oftentimes, I think, like you're saying, AJ, that the internal change starts with an external change. And good news for you, that's often the easiest thing to get done. Swapping out furniture, getting new signs, getting something like those are easy things that you can get done that start that process. Of course, that alone does not change your culture. If it were, that is just trying to put lipstick on a pig.
Yeah.
But it can start there.
Well, working towards completing the temple was a communication piece because, at that moment in time, not all of the remnant of Israel understood what they were doing. It had to be communicated. And that was part of the communication was we're actually working on this now. There's action taking place. Action is communication.
Right. All right. Number 3, third and finally, AJ, if we want it, so if we have to cast the vision, number 1, cast the vision for what we want the culture to be. Number 2, we have to start with the external things, a visualization of that new culture. Sometimes that can be changing signs or changing furniture or redecorating something, just very sort of external things. Then step 3, now we're going a layer deeper. We have to target old behaviors. So tell me a little, what does that look like to target old behaviors?
Well, this is rather elementary, but staying the same does not equal change. So you could do the math on that. That's an equation that I just created. You've got to target old behaviors. And so you have to have a mechanism in which acting the same, especially in unhealthy ways, is able to be brought to mind, able to be held accountable, able to be shifted and changed. So
that's a good point. AJ, you're saying it's elementary, but I think at some level, most people just operate out of default. And I don't think that I don't think that they're self-aware of harmful or negative behaviors that need to be targeted for change. Like, I don't think so. I think people just do what they're used to doing. I don't think they're thinking, I'm going to continue this negative bad habit.
Right. Yeah. Well, so let me just kind of bring in a little bit more of an example of how this might work. Because whenever we work with churches, Scott, we take them through understanding what their present core values are. What do you truly value as a church based on your actions? Because actions identify what you value.
Right.
In many cases. So
in every case, you do what you value.
What we end up with also with most churches that we work with is at least a short list of things that are really unhealthy. They valued things that were not productive, or they were not healthy. They were not sometimes not even biblical.
Mhm.
And we don't just discard those and go, okay, that's really bad. Let's get rid of that. I encourage them actually write these down, have these in some form in which, not publicly, but the leadership of the church, the staff, or any decision makers, boards, councils, you need to hold on to these for a period of time. I guess you could say until you really can confidently say your culture has shifted.
Mm.
You have to have these markers that say, here's what we don't do anymore.
Mhm.
And I think that's a super helpful list to have. And hopefully it's not a long list, but that way you have that accountability. You can catch each other and say, you know what, we're kind of this whole discussion that we're having right now leading towards this decision
Mhm.
really looks a lot like our, what I call anti-values over here, the things that we don't want to act like or do anymore. And you need to have that. You've got to have that reminder that our old behaviors, we drew a line in the sand and we said, this will change from this point forward. And if you cast off and you just forget what those old things were, like someone who looks at themselves in a mirror and then goes away and immediately forgets what they look like.
Yep.
You've got to take a selfie what you look like right now, because you're saying you want to look different. And you've got to be able to refer back to that on, the Instagram of culture and say,
This
yeah,
is my
right.
before picture. Yeah.
This is my
Yeah.
before picture.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You have to have that self-awareness and going, so it's both things. It's knowing who you want to be and knowing what you don't want to be. And when you see yourself creeping into those old behaviors, for example, if you're a church right now that you generally operate out of tradition,
Hmm.
saying, okay, well, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to operate out of tradition anymore. Um, when you find yourself starting to say the words, or you hear someone in your elder meeting start to say the words, well, we've always done it this way, then you can say, whoa, hold on a minute. Didn't we say we're not going to operate that way? That's not going
Yeah.
to be the rubric that we use to make decisions anymore.
Right.
Um, and then put forward not just the negative, but the positive. We said we're going to be, a church that thinks of others first. So,
Mm-hmm.
we're not going to operate out of, we've always done it this way. We've said we're going to have this externally focused culture. So how can we think of others first in this situation? And
Yeah.
so you can't just have the negative. We don't want to be this. You have to have that positive, which we talked about sort of in step 1,
Mm-hmm.
but target those behaviors. So I would suggest that you need both step 2 and step 3 for this thing to work. I mean, if you don't change the visual things around you, the visual cues, it's
Mm-hmm.
going to be hard to target behaviors. But if you don't target behaviors, then the visual cues around you are kind of irrelevant.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, just to kind of summarize again, you need the spark of a new idea, be that, from one person or from a group of people. You need
Mhm.
to then communicate that idea well, verbally, visually. And
Mhm.
then you need to, having identified what you don't want to be anymore, you've got to move forward in changing that behavior. And over time, this is how culture can change in your church too. We believe that it can. And we believe that you individually can do that. And we would love to help you do that. So you're certainly welcome to reach out to us. You can email us, leadership@malfiersgroup.com. We've got a lot of resources online as well at malfiersgroup.com. And you can read about this particular topic at malfiersgroup.com/31. This is our 31st episode of the Church Revitalization Podcast. We're so glad that you joined us. We love being able to bring this content to you. And we even more so love the interactions and conversations that we have with you in between these episodes, because those are happening every day. And that's really the core of our ministry is connecting with you and providing resources, and then even being able to be there with you and walk alongside you as you make these culture changes in your church. God bless you for your ministry. We thank you, and we're looking forward to having you back next week.